Well, we wouldn't be here tonight if it wasn't for Phyllis Katz, who made this all happen. So I'm going to introduce her, and then she's going to take on with the evening. Sorry, I'm not used to this thing, and I promised Liza I'd use it.
You're doing well.
I'm not tall enough, and I can't read. It's supposed to be down, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, we all know Phyllis as a classic scholar and as a teacher at the Mouths program, but we think of her as a friend and neighbor. We're so glad that Arnie and Phyllis moved from the outer lands into town. It's so wonderful to see them walking around, walking the dog, coming to the bookstore. One of the best parts about this bookstore, one of the best parts about having a bookstore in a town, and in the town of Norwich, is the people who live here and the people who have made this such a success, and you guys. So I'd like to welcome Phyllis Katz. Thank you.
Thank you, but this program really isn't about me.
But you made it happen.
Okay. I did have a part in making it happen, but the person who really made it happen was Carol Sheehan. Who put together the wonderful essays of Donald Sheehan and made sure that they got edited with her wonderful editing skills and published into this beautiful book called The Grace of Incorruption. It's just a treasure to have, and I want to thank Carol for it. The event is happening because Carol asked me if we might have something at the Norwich Bookstore, and I said, well, I think I can talk to the Norwich Bookstore people. They might be interested. So this event is really a celebration of a man who gave much of his life to poetry and to 30 years of it to the Frost Place, and encouraged so many of us to be poets, to learn about poetry, to dare to try to be good poets. He never made any of us feel like we weren't as good as anybody else who ever came to the Frost Place. We were part of the whole experience of immersing ourselves in poetry. So there are three of us tonight that are going to talk about things that happen in this book that relate to us as poets and to Don's life as poet, scholar, and spiritual human being, and all those things are infused in this beautiful book, which I hope that all of you will read, and you'll get little tastes of it tonight. So the way we're going to do this is that there are three of us: Cleopatra Mathis, who has served as a poet and a member of the board at the Frost Place and as a wonderful poet, and then Baron Wormser, who's also very involved in the Frost Place and has been for years, and also a marvelous poet in the area. And then I am taking on the persona of Sid Lee. I know I don't look at all like Sid Lee, but,
Thank God.
but we found that it was impossible to get three poets who are as busy as Cleopatra, Baron, and Sid together for a single event, and Liza Bernard kept a chart of trying to get the date when all three of them could be together. And we decided that we would have to settle for two, and we've got two very wonderful poets who have spent so much time with Don, and I did teach with Don and knew him very well, and Sid has given some remarks of his for me to read, so you will hear Sid's voice even though it will be in my stead. So the first person who's going to talk about this book and read a little of it is Cleopatra Mathis, and then she'll be followed by Baron Wormser, who is going to give you another sense of some of the content of this book and how important it is, and how it's important to all of us who are writers and thinkers and people who are trying to find our inner selves as well. And then I will read some comments from Sid, and if time permits, a poem of Sid's, and then at the end, Parker Towle, who has also been a wonderful supporter of the Frost Place, has a poem that he'd like to read. And then hopefully Carol will say something if she wants to, but if she doesn't, that's okay too. She's here, and that's wonderful. So enjoy this.
It's wonderful to be here, celebrate this book. And incredibly wonderful to have Carol in the audience as well. I want to tell you before I start that I have a tremor, and it's better than it was the last time I was here, and now there's even a podium, so thank you. And also, because I can get very emotional, and especially trying to talk extemporaneously, I've unfortunately written my comments out. I hope you won't be offended if I read what I have to say rather than speak. But, you know, I've only been a teacher for 47 years, and I still can't talk to a group of people. Reading this incredibly wonderful book, which is so various, and it has so many different ways of being as you read along in it, that I really hope you will have a chance to read it. I came back over and over again to how much Don meant to me at the Frost Place when I met him in 1979, and how, without even knowing it, I was so affected by his faith, which I guess I didn't really realize was so strong until I started thinking later, much later, about the contribution he had made to the Frost Place. I met Don in 1979 when I came to teach at the first Frost Place conference. I was a young mother with a newborn daughter and a first book of poems. He was not Russian Orthodox at that point, but I think ready for the church to enter his life in the profound way that it did. The preparation and groundwork for his Orthodox faith had been formed in his childhood, and it manifested itself in his ability to love. I think that even though it was Don's commitment to poetry that drew me to him at first, poetry was just a metaphor in Don's life, and I think it was the metaphor for his love of life, all life, human, animal, and the natural world. For Don, the poem was not an end, but a means. I think the reason the poetry conferences that Don ran so many years at the Frost Place, and I think the reason they were so successful, and the reason that people came back again and again, year after year, didn't have as much to do with his expertise as a poetry critic, but instead how he fostered in us the possibility of communion and relationship, the privilege of trying to find words for what we knew but couldn't say. We were there to acknowledge the struggle of others, and in doing that, be recognized. That human connection was far, far more apparent to me than anything he said to me about poetry. Although as I knew him, I began to see he kept the two together, faith and the writing, and the attempt at writing. Through the poem, we are allowed to access the depths of who we are. This is possibly the reason that some of us think of writing as a kind of prayer, many times a painful prayer. This was at the heart of Don's brilliance as a teacher. The poem's success was finally irrelevant. The poem existed as a cry out to something larger, something that we could only sense and stab at in our writerly moments, but never fully articulate. Mystery lies at the core of the poem. In the book, in his discussion of Psalm 87, Don quotes the courage to enter the darkest places, which is a comment I make to my students all the time, and later, to suffer the abandonment that draws you closer to God. It was the desire to accept and therefore love, and to love in a flawed state, that made Don's example so profound for me. It's true that he taught me to be a better poet, but it's also true that even more, he taught me how to teach. As I draw near to leaving 47 years in the classroom, I would hope more than anything that my students understand that it is not the finished poem and all its linguistic accomplishment that matters, but the ongoing process that allows a writer a glimpse into the truth of self and the indecipherable, holy state of being alive. I'd like to read the beginning of the book, the very beginning, first chapter. Coming Home is the title, and it's the story of Don's coming into grace. Obviously, I'm only going to read a couple of pages, but I hope that it'll be a good introduction for you to the book. Coming home. I was raised in a violent home where, until I was 9 years old, my father's alcohol addiction fueled his open or just barely contained violence. A home where my mother was beaten over and over. I remember her face covered with blood. Alcohol broke apart my home in a violent paroxysm the night of July 4th, 1949, the summer I was 9. The police were in our living room in the small hours of July 5th. I remember all of this very clearly. Some 3 weeks earlier, in June, I was shot in the chest with a pistol, the bullet entering 2 inches below my heart. The gunman was my best friend, also age 9. And we had found his big brother's target pistol while we were playing at his house. What I remember most vividly about the shooting, I remember viscerally without having to make any conscious effort at all to remember, is lying on the operating table and seeing the doctor over me, his hands at the wounds skillfully and tenderly probing for the bullet, his great arms and torso coming down to me, his face silent in concentrated stillness bending over me, his hands intimate and strong and exact and delicate. And I remember, too, my father and mother coming into the operating room, my father hastily dressed as he fought through a thick hangover to put clothes on, both their faces made into vivid masks of desperate panic. But I remember feeling absolutely serene in the hands of this doctor. My parents' terror did not touch me as I attended peacefully to those hands that were giving my life back to me, hands that were undoing the death my hapless friend had almost dealt me. Some 3 years later, my home would break apart, and my mother would take the 3 of us children, my sister, brother, and me, to her brother's home. But the terror of the July 4th catastrophe would not grip me the way it would, as it would have a month before. It would not shake me the way a dog shakes a tiny animal it has seized to break its neck. By the time of the breaking, I had had other hands at my heart. I had had my life given back to me. That summer of 1949, my family's home slowly but surely moved to the July 4th catastrophe. By the last week of June, I had almost fully recuperated from my gunshot wound, but my father's drinking had grown worse. He would come home every afternoon those days fairly drunk, and then through the evening he would get very drunk. And as he got drunker, he would begin a pattern of outbursts of rage and smashing of things, followed by periods of eerie calm. After each outburst, the 4 of us, my mother, sister, brother, and I, would tiptoe around, speaking only in soft whispers so as not to trigger the next round of rage. But on this particular evening in late June, the bouts of raging had grown longer, and the calm spells meant only that he was regathering his will for the next round of violence. The second round that evening had been about 20 minutes of raging at all of us in the kitchen and breaking some dishes, and then he stormed out of the kitchen and through the dining room and into the living room, and all was suddenly quiet. Making my way on tiptoe through the dining room, I peeked around the living room door. He was sitting on the couch, staring at his hands. Then I did something that still takes my breath away. I walked across the living room and sat down on the couch right next to him. I picked up a magazine from the coffee table and opened to the first pictures I came to, and I pointed to one. "Look, Dad, isn't that interesting?" I didn't dare look at him. No answer. After a moment, I looked up, and I found he was looking down at me. Over 50 years later, I can still see my father's eyes. They were sad eyes, yet peaceful, warm, and profoundly young, with all the wildness gone out, and in place of it, something like stillness. And I felt all at once peaceful, the way I'd felt on the operating table at the hospital 3 weeks before. He looked at me for a long, long minute, and then he spoke. "You're the only one not afraid of me." I was just old enough to know what gratitude sounded like in my father's voice. And so to this day and hour, I know what the person my father is sounds like when he speaks. The moment was quickly swept away, for that summer in my family's life was wholly in the violent hands of Satan. But that moment was, beyond every logic I knew, a seed. So you can tell that you won't get very far into this book without being completely there for it. And it's a really amazing, amazing experience to think about this man who's not here with us and who had still everything to say to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Cleopatra. That was beautifully eloquent. I met Dawn in the early 1990s, and actually our first conversation focused on a sort of peculiar thing we had in common. We both lived off the grid. So actually we were able to talk things like canning and wood heat and pretty mundane things. But then I quickly realized that I was in the presence of someone who in many ways was far from a mundane man. I started something at the Frost Place called the Frost Place Seminar around the year 2000. And I started it in part because I had known Don then for, I don't know, about 10 years. And I just wanted to hear Don talk, basically. And I knew there was just so much in there. And so this book is a marvelous glimpse into one of the richest minds and spirits I've certainly ever encountered. I was thinking the other day of things Don talked to us about. Some of them are in this book, The Winter's Tale, Dostoevsky, which I'm going to talk a little about. That story that Cleopatra just read to us. But Don also talked to us about things like Plotinus, translating Sappho, the Psalms, of course, the importance of icons. We all sort of just sat there with our jaws open, basically, because his erudition was phenomenal, but also, of course, his spirit was phenomenal. These things mattered deeply to him. They were personal. He wasn't ever talking for the sake of talk. One of the great sentences for me in this book, which I remember Don saying this when he was telling us the story of how he came to prayer, as it were. And I'll read you the paragraph. He says, "Then I suddenly remembered. Years before, I had read J.D. Salinger's beautiful story, Franny and Zoe, where Franny has a great desire to say this prayer called the Jesus Prayer. And she carries around with her a little book with this title. I was stunned. Among other wonders, I never knew until this moment that it was a real book Franny was carrying. I thought Salinger had invented it for his story." That just says everything away about the whole endeavor that Don was involved in at the Frost Place, in terms of he was around a lot of people who, shall I say, invented a lot of things. Okay. So it's very understandable he would have that outlook. On the other hand, he had this I don't know how to say this feeling for the reality of spirit and the embodiment of spirit and living spirit, not talking about spirit, but living it. And that's what Don did. It's also, I think, not quite accidental that he came through it in a way through the likes of Salinger, who, of course, is considered, a curious writer, because he refused to be a writer the way people sort of wanted him to go be a writer. Okay, I want to read to you a little bit, a couple sentences from Don's essay on Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov, which again I heard Don talk about this at the Frost Place. I just want to emphasize some points in this essay that have to do with the world of poetry. Don's receptivity to poetry, as Cleopatra was talking, was extraordinary. Just not like anything I've ever encountered, basically. I've known a lot of poets, probably too many by this point in time. And there was, I never met anyone like Don in terms of that receptivity. So as you hear some of these remarks by Don, try to see them and hear them through the filter also of poetry. So there's just some words that I thought were huge words in this essay that reflect who Don was. Together, he's referring now to a passage in the Brothers. Together, these three strands, the resurrected self, the relational self, and the joyful self, are the three defining aspects of personhood in the Brothers Karamazov. And that's the word for me, is personhood. You always felt when you were with Don that he was apprehending you in that depth that personhood can represent, but honestly, typically doesn't. And yet he was aware of, and he sought to cultivate that dimension in each of us. Don reminded me a lot of a Tibetan Rinpoche where, he came to America, was here for a while, and someone said to him, "What do you think Americans need to do?" And he said, "I think they need to be human beings." And, Don had that sense of how important it was that we might be human beings. Okay, this is a passage now from Dostoevsky, from the Brothers. And it seems to me there's so much strength in me now that I can overcome everything, all sufferings, only in order to say and tell myself every moment, I am in 1,000 torments. I am writhing under torture, but I am locked up in a tower, but still I exist. I see the sun, and if I don't see the sun, still I know it is. And the whole of life is there in knowing that the sun is. This is Don's remark about that. This speech is, if you will, pure ontological song, wherein the singer's affirmation of being, I am, communicates ontological ecstasy to every living thing in such a way that each created thing remains entirely and perfectly itself. At the very same moment, each thing becomes a single note in the singer's vast song. That's what poetry is. For me, he's defined it. The beautiful thing about poetry, nothing against the world of fiction and nonfiction, but nothing has to happen for there to be a poem. Being is enough. That's it. They're flowers, that's it. We don't need anything more. And poetry gets that. Poetry gets that ontological ecstasy. There's that poem by Theodore Retke, which goes, I am, said the lamb. And same thing. Same sort of thing. Just being. And again, I think Don understood that so beautifully. So there was never, as Cleopatra said, when he was teaching, when he was working with it, there wasn't any of that pushing. There wasn't any of that, betterment stuff. It's here. It's here already. Okay, we're just finding it more, so to speak. That's all we're doing. Okay, a little more from Don's incredible essay here on Dostoevsky. Okay. He's referring to someone who's writing about Dostoevsky here. For it elucidates two powerful and connected ideas. One, that we can strongly, albeit obscurely, intuit the way wherein this empirical world of our actual lives is in fact rooted in the heavenly, the higher heavenly world of God. Okay, that's one. And then Don, again, lived that and showed us that in terms of, poetry, of course, has all these figures like Blake and all these poets and we read about those people and think, well, what was that? What was Blake? But he looked at the sun and he saw angels and what was going on there? And what was going on there was just what Don wrote. That there is this verticality, that goes down into the earth and up into the sky. And poetry is this, pathway that's always going back and forth between those places. Two, and that what bears fruit in this world does so only when we nurture in our lives those three seeds Dimitri discovers, which God has directly sowed in us, the capacities to remember our real self, to breach the walls of our autonomy, and to seek and embrace the real joy that follows the ending of false freedom. I particularly call your attention to Don's phrase, to breach the walls of autonomy. Okay? That's what the Frost Place was to me. It breached the walls of autonomy. So, everybody would come to the Frost Place, and it's very natural for poets to sort of be like this because they are holding something called my poem. We know the stance very well. And what Don did basically is to say, well, yes, your poem, but also your poem and your poem and your poem and your poem. So it's not just, it is our poem, okay? Because we're all part of the stream, river, whatever you call it, of poetry. And Don just communicated that so beautifully. Okay. I want to end here with two words that are very crucial words for Don and what he gave us. So he's talking here about, again, the brothers. The chapter ends this way. This is from Dostoevsky. Someone visited my soul in that hour. Alyosha would say afterward, with firm belief in his words. In memory eternal, the beloved dead act in love directly in the lives of the living, which is why I think many of us are here tonight. This also from Don. This relates to what Cleopatra just read us. But from a very bad family too, one can keep precious memories if only one's soul knows how to seek out what is precious. And I think that's the gift that Don gave us, and animated by those two words, soul, which is obviously an enormously important word for poetry, since poetry is a spiritual endeavor and a spiritual gift, but also that little word precious. We live in a world in which it almost seems like everything gets devalued and monetized, basically. That's not poetry. And so that feeling of what could be precious, Don gave us, and I will thank him as long as I'm in this world. Thank you.
Thank you. So many wonderful insights to so many memories they evoke in me of the years that I have been going to the Frost Place and the years that I spent teaching with Don and going to the conference when he would introduce the poets. And he always made us all feel we were all great poets, no matter whether we were or we weren't. He really endowed us with that feeling that we had in us the same thing that every other poet has. So I'm going to turn to be Sid Lee for a few minutes. And Sid sent me a message about his response to this book, and I want to read that. And then I'm going to read, there's a poem, a wonderful poem by Sid's that Don discussed with quite a bit of very very sensitive detail, and I'm going to read the poem. It's a little bit long, but it's such a wonderful poem, I think you'll enjoy it. So here's what Sid wrote. In The Grace of Incorruption, Donald Sheehan discusses my poem, Wonder, Red Beans, and Ricely. He does so in the context of Frost's stunning An Old Man's Winter Night and certain writings by the Orthodox Saint Dionysius. Don had this wonderful ability to fold all that together and just make it so that chapter begins with a poem by Robert Frost, and it moves into Dionysus, and then it moved to Sidley, and they all belong together. It's just quite remarkable. So he goes on and he's talking about Don discusses my poem. While I had neither figure in mind, neither Dionysus or Frost, or certainly not, at least not St. Dionysius, when I composed this poem, I am, as so often, astonished by Don's capacity to muster all his resources and to penetrate to the very heart of an author's intentions, even if these be, as also so often, not entirely evident to the author himself. I love that comment. Something that finding in what the author's written, what the writer didn't know was there. So here, and then Sid goes on. Here's part.
Excuse me, Phyllis, people aren't hearing you back
Sorry,
there.
I'm sorry.
Maybe lean.
Okay. Should I go back, or are you okay? Yes, okay? All right. So here's this goes on, what Sid says. Here's part of what Don writes. What brings together these three, Dionysius, Frost, and Lee, is the reality of personhood, a reality beyond all the false lights of personality and persona, a reality at once forever hidden in darkness, yet simultaneously shining in an eternally radiant beauty. This is the beauty of personhood, a beauty that never fades. When I read this passage from The Grace of Incorruption, I was nearly floored. Yes, I thought, Mrs. Still said, yes, I thought, that is exactly right. How did Don know it when even I did not? He knew it because he was Don. Simple as that. So, to go on a little bit about what Don says about this poem, which I will read you in a minute, but this is a long introduction to the poem because it's so important to see why Don included this poem of Sid's. Poet Sidney Lee's book Ghost Pain has a poem in it toward the end called Wonder, Red Beans, and Ricely. That happens to be the way Louis Armstrong signed all his autographs. So that's part of what this poem is about, just to give you a little teaser. In it, Lee tells of an experience some 40 years earlier when he and his cousin and their girlfriends attend a concert in a large tent called the Sunnybrook Ballroom in East Jesus, PA, where the famed Louis Armstrong blows the four-note opening phrase of West End blues and then pauses. A long, long pin drop pause, says Lee. Moment so powerful, he says, that it lingered strong, beginning to end, through the blues that followed. And this is Don again going on about the poem. What is this astonishing moment? It is a moment entirely empty of any and every conceivable sound, as everyone, Lee says, sits absolutely still and rapt, and even the stars in the night sky stop blinking, and the cows and great-eyed deer in the surrounding fields and woods are stock still. St. Dionysius would say of this moment, we can just hear his voice. All the false light of every earthly sound has gone absolutely out, so that we can unhearingly hear the sound that is beyond all sounds. That's the poet in Don, right? The poet is always there. So now, excuse me a minute, I forgot to bring the book over with the poem in it. I don't know if Sid would have read this whole poem, but I think you will enjoy it, and I think it fits beautifully into what Cleopatra has said and Barron has said about Don. It's called, again, Wonder, Red Beans, and Ricely. He blew the famous opening figure of West End blues, and then a long pause, a long, long pin drop pause. This sounded like nothing the four of us had been hearing out here at the famous Sunnybrook Ballroom in East Jesus, PA. which was in fact a moth-eaten tent into which in summer the post-war big bands, then fading into the 50s, the likes of the Elgars or Les Brown and his band of renown, would arrive to coax the newly middle-aged and their elders into nostalgia and dance. My cousin, our pretty steadies, and I were younger, cocksure, full of contraband beer, but the moment I speak of knocked even us in the know-it-all chops. I suddenly dreamed I could see through the tent's canvas top clear up to the stars that stopped their fool blinking and planets that stood stock still over cows and great-eyed deer in the moonlight and ducks ablaze on their ponds, because everything in God's world understood this was nothing like anything they'd known before. It's still a fantasy, that sorry tent, a lantern, transparent as glass, through which I beheld the landscape around it, as though it showed in some low country more than masterpiece while no one danced. The crassest fat-necked burgher in the crowd sat rapt, as did his missus, the moment being that strong. It lingered strong, beginning to end, through the blues that followed. Then Belva Middleton got up to jive and bellow. She broke the charm, her scintillant dress like a tent itself, and people resumed the Lindy and foxtrot, as she and he traded the always good for laughs double meanings of big butter and Eggman, that's my desire, and so on. And so we four, or rather we two boys, resumed our drinking and boasting until the band took its break, full enough now of the bud and some of the rum that the cousin had brought, which would take him in too sadly short a time away to another shore forever. I stood and pledged, I'll get his autograph. It made no sense at all. I staggered to and through the canvas's backstage hole, the mocking jibes of cousin and sweethearts dying behind me, and beheld a roll of semi-trucks, his equipage. There were 2 doors as to a house in each and a little set of metal steps beneath. Without a hitch, I climbed one stair of the bunch. It made no sense, except it did. I knew. Something had burned into my reeling brain that when that opening solo started, and the man would have to be just there where he was when I knocked on one of the several doors inside the trailer, and the growl was fate. It didn't surprise me. Come in, he said. How could he? How could he not? I came. It was meant to be, and still I stammered with puzzlement, shame. I'd had a vision, yes, and yet to have the vision there before me, wonder. Great Armstrong at a desk in an undershirt, suspenders flapping, his face near blinding, sweat beads charged by the gimcrack rack of fluorescent lights so that he seemed to wear an aura. It was all one supple motion. The way he reached into a drawer, drew out a jug of Johnny Walker, sucked it down to the label, squared before him a sheet of paper, ready for me, it seemed, flourished a fountain pen and wrote, "Red beans and ricely yours at Sunnybrook Ballroom. Pops." Back at the table, they judged it was real enough by the looks. I just walked in and got it, I bragged, as if a miracle hadn't transpired, as great as any I'd ever know. I bragged as if my part in it were all important somehow, and God hadn't just looked down and said, well, okay, him. And what remains from them? Then not the paper, long since lost, nor the lovely silken girls, Sally and Barbara, nor the cousin, as I've said, who crossed the foulest river, nor that brash, that truly and stunningly blessed younger I, nor the heaven-struck beasts and the trees and the moon and the sky, just a handful of opening notes from a horn, which are there forever. It seems to me that that poem so beautifully encapsulates what there is about Don, and the fact that it says, I don't know, what's he say, how did Don know it when I did not, what this poem was about, and he knew it because he was Don, simple as that. And that's the message that I wanted to share. I'm going to invite Parker Towle to read a poem he wrote that Don inspired, and then I'm going to end with a poem that I wrote from teaching with Don, and then maybe we'll have a conversation for a few minutes about what you've heard, and anybody who wants to speak, and there are many people here who knew Don and may want to. Ready, Parker?
Go to the playhouse.
At the festival conference, every morning for the 7 days, every year for what was it, 25 or 26 years, Don would give a short talk, 30, 40, 50 minutes, and he had a rapt audience. And I was sitting there as, I don't know if I think I was a faculty member with the auditors, and Don told a short story. And as soon as he finished, I sat back down in my chair, and wrote it out as close as I could. And then, of course, it's gone through the process that all our poems have gone through, year in and year out. What he said there was he was trying to illustrate the sort of slippery nature of words. You were just using the words, but they're much more than what we really comprehend. There's a mystery. And that's what this poem's about. Hooking rugs and ice fishing. He volunteered with a dying patient, expecting to go through the 5 stages of grief at the first meeting. Instead, she talked about hooking rugs, the needle, the thread, the cloth, the rhythmic movements of the hands. He tried other matters in conversation. She talked of hooking rugs. On the next visit, she spoke of the intricacies and hardships of ice fishing that her husband had done before his death. Week after week, hooking rugs and ice fishing. Angered, he said to friends, "I can't go on with this interminable hooking rugs and ice fishing." One day, as they sat in the hospital cafeteria, she going on, he bored and vexed with hooking rugs and ice fishing, the room went silent. Air turned a luminous shade of green. Hooking rugs and ice, fishing stopped. She leaned over and said, "I could not have done this without you." Then on again with hooking rugs and ice fishing. Soon after she died. At the funeral, relatives said to him, "Thank you. All she ever spoke about was you."
Well, I wrote this poem after Don died, and as I've said before, I had the pleasure of teaching with him classes, and learned so much about being a good and sensitive teacher from him. So this is called Elegy for a Good Man. It was his bright blue eyes that captivated, before you ever saw the long white beard, the modest gingham shirt and sandaled feet, or heard the dulcet tones of a voice so gentle it seemed more like prayer, and very often was. His was a spiritual and simple world. When his students read their poems to him, his first response when they had finished was always one word: beautiful. And by the magic of that pure spoken word, the poems were. For he understood the hearts of poets more than anyone I've ever known, heard each novice work with such an open mind that he could find the essence in the core of someone's poem and make it sing for its creator, no matter how unpolished it might be. He knew the best bards of every age and hosted the most successful poets of our time at annual Frost Place festivals, but still he asked them to remember when they were there. As colleagues among all the writers who attended, despite awards and accolades they'd garnered, and when each festival commenced, he spoke of love and generosity, of the vital need to find the unique beauty in another's work, to value it as if it were our own, his legacy for us. Well, that ends it. little time remaining if anybody would like to get up and speak about Don or ask, if anybody wants to ask questions. We've just touched the surface of this wonderful book and the spirituality of it, and it's so beautifully written. So I hope you all will read around in the chapters and get to enjoy it. Anybody else? Carol, would you want to say anything? No? You don't have to. Carol is Don's widow and the editor of this beautiful book.
I think what I would say is that, first of all, I can't talk about Don without crying, so forgive me. I knew that when I was finished with this book that I would miss him even more. And now I'm trying to figure out what to do next. So if any of you have tapes, things he's written, let me know. I've made a website. Some of you may know. It's subdeacon.donald.sheehan on Facebook. It's not a website, it's a Facebook page. It's a public page, so you don't have to be a Facebook follower to read it. I'm putting on there things that arise, things I find that people have written about him, things that are published. I'll put up some things from here if I can get copies of them. But I would like to go on with it. And there's a lot of his work that I've not looked at yet. Journals. I met somebody, I was talking with a friend the other day who said he had boxes of lectures on tape. Somebody's going to have to tell me how to digitize those. Anyway, so if any of you want to contribute in any way to an ongoing publication of Don's work, I'm happy to receive whatever you got. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for coming. Thank you.
Anybody else want to talk? Thank you for coming. It's been a wonderful, no, sorry. Come on up.
Oh, no, can I
there?
talk from here?
Yeah, sure.
Is there anyone else here who went to Franconia College?
You went what?
Franconia College? Okay. I was blessed to go to a tiny little dinky college up in the White Mountains where they had the most brilliant professor that you could have found at any college in the country. And that was Donald Sheehan. That was more than 40 years ago. Carol, I'm gonna cry too. And I remember the first time I ever met him, he walked into this classroom and he had his short hair clean shaven and his little Russian glasses, his piercing eyes, and I was hooked. As were many of the other students at this college, he would have 20 of us sitting on the floor reading War and Peace in the evening, riveted. Each person in the room, no matter how inane their comments were or how off the point, he would pull it in and he would make it personal and real, and War and Peace was our life. It was our story, and it directly affected who we were. And then we'd move to the next book and it would be the same. To the point where after the class would get out at 10 and we'd all go down to the cafeteria and talk till 1 in the morning about War and Peace or whatever book we were reading. And at the end of the semester you'd go and you'd find out what's Don teaching next semester, and you'd sign up for it. You didn't care what it was, whether it was ancient Greek or creative writing, you signed up for it. It was Don Sheehan you were studying. And I was telling Carol, I think he was the most brilliant man and human being I've ever met in my life. And he had a profound effect on me and my inner life and my direction in life. And I'm eternally grateful to Donald and Carol for sharing their brilliance with me over 40 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.